nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barrett.
I'm Chaz Gidello.
This week, 1 year since the death of George Floyd, how much has really changed? Our special guest, the Rev Al Sharpton.
Plus, as the US government prepares to release a report on what it knows about UFOs, we're going to talk to the former head of the Pentagon unit who is trying to figure out what's really out there. And it is really out there. But first...
This week marked 1 year since 46-year-old George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer who was arresting him on suspicion of using a fake $20 bill. Former officer Derek Chauvin was convicted of Floyd's murder last month after kneeling on Floyd's neck for almost 9.5 minutes, a crime which was filmed by an onlooker and sparked protests around the world. On Tuesday, members of George Floyd's family were guests at the White House and called on Congress to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which has passed the House but is still being negotiated in the Senate.
If you can make federal laws to protect the bird, which is the bald eagle, you can make federal laws to protect people of color.
Tim Scott, the only African-American Republican in the Senate, is heading up negotiations from the Conservative side, and he is seen as being the key to wider Republican support. One of the non-negotiable issues for many Democrats, though, ending so-called qualified immunity, shielding officers from civil lawsuits stemming from their police work. President Biden, though, says he is confident a bipartisan deal will be reached.
I've spoken with the negotiators. I'm hopeful that sometime after Memorial Day we'll have an agreement on the George Floyd legislation.
And the clock is ticking, Chaz. He had set a deadline of this week, the anniversary of Floyd's death. Memorial Day is next Monday.
I should explain, before we move on, what qualified immunity is in detail, because this is critical to this issue. It's a legal doctrine invented by the Supreme Court that requires any misconduct alleged against the police to be almost exactly like a pre-existing court precedent. Otherwise, the cops get off. So, for example, qualified immunity has stopped police from being sued for stealing $225,000 while executing a search warrant because there was no direct precedent for that. It stopped them being sued for beating and arresting a man staying outside his own house, and it stopped them being sued for shooting an unarmed 15-year-old. Now, the Democrats have maintained that individual officers should be held personally accountable by lawsuits for their misconduct, but Republicans have said no. So Tim Scott's solution is to require the city to bear the costs of the lawsuits, not the officers. Now, this is a clever idea because the government have paid 99.98% of dollars recovered in misconduct lawsuits over the last few years anyway. So if that works, it's a clever way in between the two sides.
Stops creating a police insurance industry, for instance. Well, 12 months on, what difference has the death of George Floyd really made? Joining us in just a moment will be the Rev Al Sharpton, the civil rights leader and former Democratic presidential candidate who delivered the eulogy at George Floyd's funeral. But first, here's a little bit of what Rev Sharpton had to say last year.
Is George Floyd's story has been the story of black folks. Because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed to be in is you kept your knee on our neck.
Rev Al Sharpton, welcome back to Planet America.
Thank you for having me back.
Eulogising George Floyd a year ago, you spoke metaphorically of there being a knee on the neck of every African American, and there has been for 400 years. In the past year, do you feel as though the pressure of that knee has been lifted at all?
I don't know that it's been lifted. It is certainly have been given cause for pause to lift it. I would think the lifting will be when we see the legislation passed that would change the laws that gave someone like Derek Chauvin, the policeman that killed George Floyd, the feeling that he could do that and get away with it. But we still have not seen the law passed. We see that there's progress, there's reported progress toward it, but it's not there. We also are seeing now the other three that were with him, the other three policemen, have yet to go on trial. We don't know what will happen there. And the Justice Department has indicted all four of them, Chauvin and the other three, on civil rights charges. So we're at a better place than we were a year ago, but we're nowhere near where we want to go. We don't want to go trial to trial. We want to see the federal laws change so that policemen will know that this is serious and that there is the legal and legislative climate that you cannot do what Chauvin did.
So would you say that the Derek Chauvin verdict was the biggest event in racial reconciliation over the last 12 months?
I would say that the Chauvin verdict is definitely that, and probably longer than the last 12 months. You know, as one who's been in this for decades, and I worked closely with the family, and National Action Network did a lot of mobilizing with other groups around the country, including the big march in August in Washington, D.C. So I was kind of like trying to temper the family's expectation that maybe we get manslaughter, I don't know. And I was stunned and happy that when that judge read that verdict 3 times, murder 2 guilty, murder 3 guilty, manslaughter guilty, I don't think any of us expected that. And that was great news. And that was a real moment of reckoning and reconciliation. But the very next morning, we had to go 10 miles up from that courthouse and do the wake, and the next day, the funeral of Dante Wright, who was killed by policemen at the end of the trial. So it didn't stop. A week later, we're in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, dealing with the trial of Andrew Brown Jr. So as much as we would like to say this is a great moment, we were immediately followed by at least 2 police killings that I had to do the eulogy in, and there probably were more. We need to change the laws. We can't go from trial to trial.
And Rev Al, what part of the George Floyd Justice in Policing bill do you think would change police behaviour more than seeing a fellow officer convicted of murder would?
Well, one, a murder conviction only deals with that defendant. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act would end qualified immunity where you cannot sue counties and cities and individual police officers for their work. People think differently when they know if they do something that is excessive or clearly murderous, they can be sued and it will cost money. Secondly, it has a national registry in it where police would be listed when they have been accused with merit of excessive force. So you can't go from one county to another and be another county's police officer. It has what is called 242, where the law presently says the policeman has to be proven to be willfully or intentionally acting in a way to cause harm or death. The changing of that language should be that they're acting recklessly and with knowledge. Because if we had to deal with the willful intent in the Chauvin case, I don't know we could have proved that he got up that morning and intended to kill George Floyd or that he willfully did it. But he certainly knew during the process of 9 minutes and 29 seconds, he certainly knew that he was being reckless, and he certainly knew that it would cause harm. And that's what we need as federal law. Those are 3 of the areas, including body cameras, that is in the George Floyd Justice and Policing bill that would be federal, which means all states would have to recognize that federal law.
It seems that federal police reform at the moment is pretty much hanging on what happens to qualified immunity. Would you prefer for the Democrats to keep holding out until they do extract qualified immunity reform from the Republicans, or do you think they should just settle for half a loaf if that's what it takes?
I would want them to hold out. I think that it is important. I think Congresswoman Bass that brought it through the House of Representatives has said that. I think it's important that qualified immunity be there. Let's look at it this way. They say, well, if you have qualified immunity, that a lot of people may not become policemen. So you're telling me we need people on the force that are saying to themselves, well, I know I'm going to act up, so I don't want to be where I can be sued. I don't want policemen that feel that they can't be trusted not to be victims of lawsuits that are justified. So I think it's good for police and it's good for the citizens. If you're a lawyer, you can be sued if you do something that is inappropriate with a case. Doctors can be sued. Why are policemen the only ones in society that is above being held accountable?
As many have observed, Reverend Al, Joe Biden would not be president today were it not for the support of African Americans in the primary and the general election last year. In your view, is he doing enough to reward that support in terms of the targeting of the COVID relief and the other big federal spending measures that we've seen so far?
So far, he's engaged us. So far, in some of the packages, there has been direct instructions to make sure, such as COVID relief, such as other areas, that it goes in areas that are most discriminated against, which is the Black community. He has reached out. I met with us virtually with civil rights leaders. He's called me personally when he was meeting with the Floyd family. He's reached out, but he's only been there 4 months. So the beginning is so much better than Donald Trump. It's hard to give an objective analysis until we can see a few more months. Right now, we're glad that we have somebody that just is not outright bigoted and outright insensitive. Joe Biden is certainly not that. Whether he's all we want, we will see. So I would assess it that we are dating, but we're not married yet.
Now, I saw a poll this week showing various groups' support for BLM, and it went right up for all people after George Floyd's death. But then after a week, it started to turn, and today, support from Republicans and from white people is considerably lower than it was before George Floyd's death. So do you think that's just a reflection of much needed issues being raised, or do you think that shows that America is still struggling with racial relations?
I think it's a matter of America struggling on racial relations and equal justice. I think that in the moment people saw it, people were outraged. I think that over time they go back into their silos. Don't forget, when Martin Luther King was killed the day before, he was low in the polls in the white and Black community. But you'd have to keep going. If we did this based on polls, we would never get out of bed in the morning. It has never been that the majority of Americans wanted to see Blacks free, Blacks equal, and Blacks treated fairly. It is not determined by what the majority wants. It's determined by how determined the minority is to get what they deserve.
Reverend Al Sharpton, thanks once again for being with us on Planet America.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, another friend of the show, Kristen Clark, was sworn in as Assistant US Attorney General and head of the Justice Department's influential Civil Rights Division this week, becoming the first woman of colour ever confirmed to that post.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 48. The motion is agreed to.
But there was just one Republican vote in favour, Susan Collins of Maine. Another, Louisiana's John Kennedy, didn't vote. Clark's nomination was controversial because of her advocacy for voting rights. Here's some of what she had to say on our program when we spoke to her about that last year.
We're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep bringing these lawsuits in states across the country because we believe deeply that the right to vote lies at the heart of American democracy.
During the confirmation process, some Republicans accused Kristen Clark of being a radical and a partisan and an advocate of defunding the police, a claim that she rejected. Republican senators also quizzed her about an article that she'd written as a student back in the early 90s in response to an infamous Charles Murray book, The Bell Curve, which linked IQ and race. Clark's response to that claimed African Americans were racially superior.
What I was seeking to do was to hold up a mirror and put one racist theory alongside another to challenge people as to why we were unwilling to wholly reject the racist theory that defined the Bell Curve book.
So this was satire?
Absolutely, Senator.
Yes, that article had been flying all over the internet in conservative circles for weeks and weeks. It was satire, but of course the US Senate is the place where satire goes to die, Chaz.
Well, it's certainly where legislation goes to die, so why should satire be any different?
Very appropriate. Donald Trump may be a step closer to facing a criminal prosecution this week. Following reports, Manhattan's district attorney has convened the grand jury that is expected to decide whether to indict the former president. Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. has been poring over Trump's tax returns for months now as a part of a 2-year probe into whether Trump misled lenders and insurance companies about the value of his properties and whether he paid appropriate taxes or not. The investigation also includes potentially illegal hush money payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels, with whom Trump allegedly had an affair. His former lawyer Michael Cohen has already served time in jail over that particular matter. But as far as former President Trump is concerned, it's just
a continuation of the greatest witch hunt in American history.
He says it's
purely political.
And he laments,
our country is broken, our elections are rigged, corrupt and stolen, our prosecutors are politicized.
And there is something to that claim, Chaz, that the process is politicised. DAs like Cyrus Vance and the State Attorney General, Tish James, are elected Democrats. And judges are political appointees too. And a lot of them would frankly quite like to see Donald Trump behind bars. But ultimately these matters are decided on their legal merits, not on partisan motives. Well, mostly.
Mostly, indeed. Look, there have been a lot of people on social media writing this news real hard, getting very excited. So we should probably let them down gently right now, John. First of all, that grand jury's been called for 6 months, so pace yourself. They could take a lot less than that, admittedly, but they also could be impaneled for longer. They also could be called for multiple cases, so for all we know, there might not be that much about Trump there at all. Also, sometimes grand juries are called without being asked to consider returning indictments. So don't assume an indictment is even potentially on the cards for Trump. Furthermore, Vance's prosecutors have been supposedly paying particular attention to Trump's accountant, Alan Weisselberg, going so far as to subpoena his personal bank records and the school his grandkids attended. So, for all we know, the possible indictment might be for him, not for Trump. Imagine that. Weisselberg's so far off most people's radar that this is the best photo the New York Times could find of him. And finally, a 6-month grand jury takes us nicely to the end of the year. And you know what happens then? Cyrus Vance's term is up and he's not seeking re-election. So, once again, for all we know, Vance doesn't so much have the goods as he's just loading up a grand jury with all his unfinished business as a means of tying up some loose ends before he's done. We just don't know. And that is before we even get to the fact that any potential trial and appeals process could take years and years and be completely inscrutable to all of us. So in short, don't get too excited.
We'll try and contain ourselves. The big $64,000 question is Alan Weisselberg the biggest fish that they're able to get in this, or do they flip him and get to the big guy? That we will see. But now to the crisis on America's southern border, where immigration facilities were being overwhelmed by a surge in arrivals of unaccompanied children. It has rather faded from the headlines in recent weeks, except if you're watching Fox News, of course. There is growing evidence, though, that many of those children are still being housed in substandard conditions. So, Chaz, what is the latest there?
Okay, well, when we left immigration, there'd just been 178,000 interceptions on the southern border in April. That was the most in a month since the year 2000. Most of those were sent right back over the border straight away, but not the unaccompanied kids, who are the people you're referring to, John. There were about 17,000 of them intercepted, well above the previous monthly peak of about 11,000 under Trump. So where do you put all those kids? Biden diverted $2 billion from other programs and used it to build them some temporary accommodation, where there are currently around 19,000 kids being processed compared to the peak under Trump of 11,400 kids. Okay, so far so good. They built all these nice centres for these kids, so there's no need for them to stay in these nasty Border Patrol detention centres. Except Texas Democrat Henry Cuellar raised a red flag. He claimed All they're doing is moving kids from one tent to the other tent and saying, oh, they're out of Border Patrol custody, but they're just next door. The problem is, all these new centres have been completely closed to the public and to the press. Even the visiting lawyers aren't allowed to take photos, which is quite suspicious, especially since the lawyers are starting to talk. One noted that the Trump administration was widely criticised for the tent city that they opened in 2019, but this new centre in Fort Bliss, which she visited, is much worse in every respect. That's what she said. It goes against everything we know about the proper care and treatment of traumatized children, she said. Another person took a few illicit photos to leak to the press, which, look, they don't look the worst, but they don't look the best either. Now, to be fair to the administration, the lawyer said there's no question the administration has worked tirelessly to move children to places that are safer than Border Patrol facilities. But nonetheless, I think we are woefully failing the children detained in many of these places. She also noted that the girls reported being constantly hungry and thirsty, saying they'd received limited servings of both food and water, including undercooked chicken and expired items. A trainer at one of these facilities said, they're filthy, they're dirty, there's food on the floor, there's wet spots all over the place, the beds are dirty. And after the kids come out of COVID isolation, they're issued new clothes, but no underwear. Very often, it's one set of clothes, so no clothes to change into, and no underwear. In short, we seem to still have a problem here, John, but the Biden administration seems to be more focused on hiding it.
Well, for decades, Chaz, unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, were fodder for science fiction, comic books and Hollywood blockbusters. If you actually believed in flying saucers and little green men from Mars, you were likely to be dismissed as a crackpot. But not anymore. UFOs have been rebranded as UAPs, or unidentified aerial phenomena, and they are now being taken very seriously and seriously investigated as a possible threat to America's national security. The declassification of video footage taken by military pilots has fueled speculation about what might be out there. And within a few days, a report is due to be released outlining everything US government agencies know about UAPs. Luis Elizondo is the former program director of the US government's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. He resigned from the Pentagon 4 years ago, protesting that the threat of UAPs was not being taken seriously enough. Luis Elizondo, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you. It is my sincere pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So, how confident are you that this report is going to disclose everything the US government knows about UAPs?
Well, I think we're pretty confident that it's not going to reveal everything. First of all, the report is supposed to be at the unclassified level. So what that means is the classified data will certainly be scrubbed from the report and provided to Congress, probably in a classified annex. So we know for a fact that this report is not going to have everything. Secondly, I think, to be realistic, this report was mandated to be delivered within 180 days. To put that into context, sometimes it takes longer to remodel a household kitchen than to provide a report to Congress of this magnitude. Let's be realistic. We're talking about a report that potentially goes back decades worth of data and information, and that is kept within a very large and disparate intelligence community. So in order to collect that information, first of all, have the clearance and the access to the information, then be able to analyze that information, and finally be able to process that information and put into a report, I don't think 180 days is realistic. So I think best case scenario, we can hope for an interim type report to Congress, followed by a much more comprehensive report later down the road.
There seem to be a very large number of UAP sightings out there in public that are hard to explain. What proportion of those sightings would you say you think actually might be alien craft? How many are we talking here?
Sure. Well, I can only speak from personal experience, and so I will only speak for myself. But during our time at ATIP, that was the program I managed at the Pentagon from 2010 to approximately 2017, we only focused on those events that we could not find an explanation to. My program was successful in identifying what we call 5 observables. Those are 5, if you will, distinct categories that allows us to separate a true UAP versus something that you might consider more conventional, like a balloon or an aircraft or a helicopter or a drone.
Sorry, what are those 5 observables? What have you actually observed?
Sure. So the 5 categories of information are what we refer to as the observables. The first one is instantaneous acceleration. The second one is hypersonic velocity. The third is low observability. The fourth observable is something we call transmedium travel. And the fifth observable is, I guess in the vernacular, you might call it anti-gravity. Each one of those performance characteristics is extremely unique and would require some sort of exotic technology in order to perform. Now, we do have technology that can do things such as instantaneous acceleration. But to put that into context, the average human being can withstand about 9 G-forces for a very short period of time before there are negative consequences associated. So, for example, we have a G-suit. A pilot might wear a G-suit in order to kind of counteract some of those forces. To put that in comparison to some of our most highly maneuverable aircraft, some of our aircraft can perform G-forces in about 16 to 17 Gs before you start having structural and mechanical failure of the aircraft. In essence, wings begin to snap off. What we're seeing are, in some cases, doing more than 600 and 700 G-forces. So certainly well beyond the healthy limitations of anything biological to withstand.
So, Mr. Elizondo, based on what you've seen and what is out there in the public domain already, what sort of a technological leap forward are we talking about? Whether it is Chinese or Russian or something extraterrestrial, are we talking about the difference between, the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk and the Apollo rockets to the moon? Is that the kind of leap we're talking about?
I think we're talking about differences between a child's kite and perhaps the space shuttle. That's probably more accurate comparison. We're dealing with a completely different paradigm of technology and a completely different understanding of physics. And so I think we're looking at not just next generation, but truly beyond next generation technology that we are witnessing right here and right now over controlled U.S. airspace.
And do you think that we will actually have confirmation in this upcoming report that at least some of these things are not Earth-based?
Well, therein lies the question. If we're dealing with foreign adversarial technology, then this will be one of the greatest intelligence failures this country has ever faced. Because despite the billions of dollars we pour into our intelligence community on an annual basis, and despite our 18 intelligence agencies, there is an adversary who has managed to leapfrog ahead of us, and not just recently, but potentially for several decades. So that's obviously a scary thought. The other alternative is that it's not adversarial technology. It's someone or something else, and therein lies yet another question, and certainly something that we all should at least consider as a possibility.
Rather than trying to infer technology from observed behaviour, have you seen any actual physical objects that were collected by the military that were definitely not from Earth?
I'm going to be very careful how I answer that question. I have stated for the record that from my understanding and my belief and my observation that the United States is in possession of some extremely exotic material. I will not elaborate further on that at this time. I have to be very careful. I still do maintain my security clearance here in the United States, and I have to respect the limitations of my non-disclosure agreement.
And why do you think it is that the US government has been keeping a lot of this stuff secret for so long? Is it that they simply don't trust the public to handle the information that's out there?
Well, let me ask you the same question. Perhaps the reason why the United States government has been somewhat cagey on this topic is the same reason that the government in Australia and the government in Japan and the governments around the world haven't been completely forthcoming, because at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. I think the U.S. government has backed itself in a corner. We have spent so much time ridiculing individuals because of taboo and stigma that it's very hard now for us to if you will, to pull back some of those statements and begin to look at this as a real subject and a real topic, a real scientific endeavor. My government recently has admitted the fact that UAP or UFOs are real, whatever it is. So I think that's certainly a good start. But there's been a lot of people in over the decades who have lost security clearances, lost their flight status, have paid a fairly significant price for having this conversation. Now it turns out they were right. So what do we do about that?
So if we are still to determine what these things that are being seen are and where they're coming from, should more be being done, though, to try and answer those questions rather than these incidental contacts that are happening over the ocean with the Navy or Air Force or whatever? Should we be sending planes up there with better monitoring equipment, actually trying to seek these things out and find out more?
Yes, yes, and yes. I think this is something that we need to look at holistically. I think there are national security equities, so we certainly would want to bring in our armed forces to look at this. As you say, the Navy and the Air Force and the Army and other branches. But I also think it's an intelligence problem. I think we need to include our intelligence community like we are doing. But I also think it's a scientific and academic problem. I think this is a whole of government approach that we should be pursuing. I think this is something that requires a lot of different expertise. And I think it's something that maybe at the end of the day, only 2 or 3 aspects involve national security. Maybe there's parts of this conversation that are philosophical and theological and psychological and sociological. Maybe there's parts of this conversation that involve Department of Energy, for example, here in my country. I think personally, if I was king for a day, I would recommend some sort of international body that has the scientific and academic expertise to help us figure this out. There are times in the past where as countries we've come together to do exactly that. I remain realistic, but I also remain hopeful that maybe this topic can help bridge some of the differences that my country has with other countries. Maybe we can find some common ground and use this topic to try to figure out what this incredible enigma for the betterment of all of mankind, not just one particular country or interest.
Luis Elizondo, many thanks indeed for joining us on Planet America.
Sir, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
This week, President Biden ordered US intelligence agencies to step up their efforts towards identifying the source of the COVID-19 pandemic. And he's asked them to report back within 90 days. It follows newly revealed details of COVID cases in Wuhan, China in late 2019, potentially linked to a local research laboratory.
The president revealing that US intelligence is currently split over 2 possible scenarios, both with low or moderate confidence. 2 agencies suspecting it came from human contact with an infected animal, and another leaning toward a laboratory accident.
Today, the New York Times is reporting intelligence officials told the White House they had a raft of still unexamined evidence that required additional computer analysis that might shed light on the mystery. The lab leak theory, either as an accident or possibly a malicious act of biowarfare, has been around since before the outbreak became a pandemic. Here's Republican Senator Tom Cotton in late January of 2020.
We still don't know where it originated. Could have been another seafood market. Could have been a farm. Could have been a food processing company. I would note that Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that works with the world's most deadly pathogens, to include, yes, coronavirus.
The thing with the lab leak theory, though, John, is that there's a big difference between suggesting that China nuked themselves with COVID as some kind of bioweapon. That is extremely unlikely. Or alternatively, saying that COVID might have been accidentally leaked when Chinese scientists were performing standard research on coronaviruses. That sounds a lot more plausible to me. But back in February last year, people were acting like those 2 theories were the same thing. Take this article from the Washington Post. Around the same time Tom Cotton made that speech. Experts debunk fringe theory linking China's coronavirus to weapons research. Indeed, the Washington Post did debunk the theory that COVID was a bioweapon. They showed analysts had discussed the possibility that weapons development at the Wuhan lab could have led to the coronavirus outbreak, but no one had found convincing evidence to support that theory. Fine. But what about the theory that it wasn't a bioweapon, but it accidentally leaked anyway? Well, they didn't focus on that. So then Tom Cotton kept on going on about it. Here he was again, being very careful to not advance a particular explanation other than this did not start in the Wuhan markets.
The virus went into that food market before it came out of that food market. So we don't know where it originated, but we do know that we have to get to the bottom of that. We also know that just a few miles away from that food market is China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that researches human infectious diseases. Now, we don't have evidence that this disease originated there, but because of China's duplicity and dishonesty from the beginning, we need to at least ask the question to see what the evidence says. And China right now is not giving any evidence on that question at all.
And the Washington Post then published another article that responded directly to that clip with Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus conspiracy theory that was already debunked, going on to say that there is no evidence that the disease originated at the lab and to suggest it possibly could have fanned the embers of a conspiracy theory that's been repeatedly debunked by the experts. But the theory their experts debunked was once again about a deliberately released bioweapon, and a bioweapon that the Chinese developed and intentionally deployed, which was the weakest possible version of Tom Cotton's argument. Then they also threw in an insinuation that he was being racist, just for the hell of it. And we saw a fair bit of this kind of talking past each other for a year. But the best illustration of this occurred when Tom Cotton then replied to that article with a series of tweets in which he specifically detailed 4 alternative scenarios for the lab leak theory, pointing out they were all very different and people should not keep focusing solely on the bioweapon option. One of those debunking experts of the Washington Post responded to Cotton's tweets with, "I am pleased to hear you now distinguish between the possibility the virus was an engineered bioweapon which can be dismissed and the possibility the virus entered the human population through a lab accident which cannot and should not be dismissed." You see how the scientists distinguish between those two scenarios? Well, the Washington Post quoted this tweet in an update to their original Cotton bashing article, and this was the bit they quoted, and this was the bit they didn't quote, the bit where their own hand-picked expert validated that one scenario from the lab leak theory was a completely legitimate possibility. That underlined bit there, that went unnoticed. So that's what happened for a year. And that is why the media potentially got this story completely wrong. Bear in mind, we still don't know what the actual truth is, okay? Biden's intelligence community investigation so far says that there are 2 theories that the virus emerged from human contact with an infected animal or from a laboratory accident. And the majority of elements do not believe there is sufficient information to assess one to be more likely than the other. Note, by the way, there is a third potential option: human contact with an infected animal as part of a laboratory accident. Either way, I reckon there's a lesson in all this if people are humble enough to notice it.
Well, there's no chance of that, Chaz, but it is the old story, a little bit like the UFOs and the UAPs. If there is government secrecy, then you get conspiracy theories, misinformation, and maybe some good ideas all being thrown into that vacuum. But until that secrecy is broken through, we just do not know. Meanwhile, the United States passed another significant milestone this week, with 50% of the adult population fully vaccinated. The announcement came in a tweet from President Biden, who added, "That's a big deal, folks."
It is a big deal. There's a lot of big deals right now, actually. Average cases per day have dropped to about 24,000, which is the lowest level since last June. Average deaths per day have dropped to about 550. That's the lowest level since last July. As for hospitalisations, their levels haven't been this low since the very start of the pandemic. And that's because vaccines are doing their job. As of a month ago, there were 101 million fully vaccinated Americans. Only 706 of those vaccinated people had been hospitalised with COVID, or 0.00069%. Only 132 of them had died from COVID, or 0.00013%. In 48 out of the 50 states, cases have been declining, and the only outliers are Idaho, where cases have increased by 2%, and Wyoming, the least populous state in the nation, where the sample size is too small to care. The only downside is that while 50% of adults have been vaccinated, That means only 39.5% of the population has been vaccinated, which is at least 10 points short of where it needs to be. Yet yesterday there were only 898,000 vaccine shots. That lowered the average to 1.75 million shots per day. That's the lowest level since February. They really need to reverse that fall off in vaccinations. And this kind of idiocy is not helping from the once National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn.
And because when you look around the world and you go, well, all these other places, why aren't all these other places having the kinds of problems that we keep getting beat over the head and shoulders on in this country about when it comes to COVID? Why? Because everything, and this is my truth, but what I believe, everything is a distraction to what happened on the 3rd of November. So everything that we hear about COVID, and that COVID started before the 3rd of November, but it was all meant to control.
I don't even know where to start, John. The rest of the world doesn't have COVID problems? Or how about the COVID hoax was invented 12 months before the election in China solely to rig the American election?
Yeah, and that is precisely why Barack Obama sacked Michael Flynn when he was president and warned Donald Trump against giving Michael Flynn a job when he was president. He did not listen. But look, during the recent conflict between Hamas in Gaza and Israel, the eyes of the world again turned to the United States to see when they would call for a truce and rein in their regional ally, Israel. Next month, the American and Russian presidents are going to sit down. They'll meet in Geneva to discuss issues including ongoing fighting in eastern Ukraine and the status of Crimea. And then in September, America will withdraw its forces from Afghanistan after the war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban that's dragged on for a full 2 decades. So we are used to America being involved in most of the world's problems and conflicts, but it's important to know it has not always been that way. For more than a century after its independence, America was largely unwilling to get involved in foreign entanglements. As America's first president, George Washington, said in his farewell address in 1796,
"All detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course."
A quarter of a century later, Secretary of State and future President John Quincy Adams maintained America would not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Being a former colony that had freed itself from British rule, America didn't seek an empire of its own, and while it maintained neutrality in European affairs and tolerated European powers having existing colonies in its region, the United States welcomed the independence of South and Central American countries like Argentina, Peru and Mexico from Spain in the 1820s. At that time, the Monroe Doctrine, named for America's 5th president, warned Europeans against expanding any further in the Western Hemisphere.
We should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety.
Although it wasn't quite a threat of you mess with them and you mess with us, because America's Navy and Army was still comparatively small. And so it was for almost all of the 19th century. Internationally, America stood for independence, democracy and getting on with business, with the notable exception of a land grab against Mexico in the 1840s that saw the United States itself expand south and west. It wasn't until the 1890s that the US started to back up the words of the Monroe Doctrine with action. Cubans were fighting for independence after 400 years of Spanish colonial rule. American newspapers sided with the Cuban cause, reporting Spanish atrocities, including the use of concentration camps. The US was already Cuba's biggest trading partner. Their Navy deployed a cruiser, the USS Maine, from Florida to Havana Harbour to protect American interests. And on February the 15th, 1898, a massive explosion destroyed the front of the ship, sinking it with the loss of over 250 lives. A Spanish inquiry blamed the blast on coal gases in the Maine's hull, igniting ammunition. An American investigation concluded
the Maine was destroyed by the explosion of a submarine mine, which caused the partial explosion of 2 or more of her forward magazines.
But did not find evidence about who was responsible for setting off the mine. Meanwhile, in the American press, the drumbeat for war was growing louder.
Remember the Maine. To hell with Spain.
There was a surge in patriotic public support for war, helping to paper over some of the lingering divisions from the American Civil War 30 years earlier. Within 2 months, the US Congress declared Cuba had the right to independence and demanded Spain withdraw their forces and authorised President William McKinley to use military force to achieve that end. In late April, Spain declared war on the United States. It was a bad move. On May 1st, ships from the US Navy entered Manila Bay in the Spanish Pacific territory of the Philippines and sunk almost the entire Spanish fleet in just a few hours, pausing at one point to have a second breakfast before resuming the fight. The war in Cuba was only slightly less one-sided. Assistant US Navy Secretary Theodore Roosevelt resigned to lead a charge of Rough Rider cavalry up San Juan Hill, making himself a hero in the eyes of the press and the American people. Within 3.5 years, he'd be president. And again, the Spanish fleet in Cuba was routed by the Americans. By July 17th, the war was effectively over. Spain had lost its crumbling empire, forced to renounce its claim over Cuba, cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and sell them the Philippines for $20 million, although the Filipinos would keep up the fight against the Americans for a few more years. Cuba soon gained its independence, but still, the United States wielded huge influence until the Communist Revolution of 1959. The Philippines wasn't granted independence until after Japanese occupation in World War II. Guam in the Pacific and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean remain US territories to this day. So, the Spanish-American War was a turning point. While the United States returned to a period of isolationism between the two world wars, it had now become a major economic and military power, prepared to fight selectively for the freedom of others, especially if there was something in it for them. Lots and lots to chat about by the fireside this week, Chaz. And following on from our discussion earlier with Rev Al Sharpton, we're talking to him about his sense of what has and has not changed in the last year. What is the polling suggesting? You made mention of some of the numbers that have come out that have suggested that Black Lives Matter is not as popular now, certainly with some folks, as it was even before George Floyd died.
Yeah, I'll show you those graphs. First of all, this is by party. So you can see Democrats still quite keen on BLM, but Republicans support BLM considerably less than they did before George Floyd died. And then similar shape of the graph by race. You can see black people support BLM, Hispanics not so much, white people really not. And you can notice both of them have the same peak. It's on July 3. July 3, for those who don't remember, was 2 days after Trump had held up that Bible in front of the church, and that's when things were really going badly for him. It was backfiring on him, and then there were a few more riots, and people started to turn. Ever since then, things have dropped right off.
And what's interesting about that to me is you can sort of say, okay, correlation to the death of George Floyd and the protests and some of the violence that accompanied a small number of those protests. But also, of course, we're talking about the start of the general election campaign. We were heading into convention season, really ramping up the political side of this, and the fact that Donald Trump saw a real opening for a law and order election, to essentially say it's 1968 all over again. The streets are on fire. The black folks are coming to get the white folks, you know, and it was by some estimations quite a winning, if not winning, a successful strategy for Trump, keeping him competitive through to November's election.
But not a winning strategy for racial harmony.
Certainly not.
And if we look at it from the other side of the coin, rather than from the white people's perspective, we look from the black people's perspective, there's some polls which are a bit ugly there as well. Like, for instance, from Ipsos, Axios, 72% of black people say police shootings have gotten worse in the last year. That's compared to 32% of whites who say the same. And 55% of blacks say calling the police does more harm than good. That's compared to 25% of white people. And I saw an amazing statistic which sums that up. There have been only 6 days this year when a police officer hasn't killed a civilian. Now, that's not just black people, that's white people as well. And often they would be justified. But nevertheless, that's the environment we are in, and they get so much more publicity now, which is probably a process we have to go through to deal with this situation. But it just makes everyone hyper-conscious of the situation. It's a very delicate time for racial relations in America.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I mean, the extent to which Black Lives Matter also fed into the surge of support for Joe Biden last November. Al Sharpton essentially is of the view that had it not been for that, getting black folks to vote where they had mostly stayed at home, didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, had voted for Barack Obama, it helped Joe Biden and probably hurt Donald Trump. Others will argue, well, there are just as many white folks who may not have voted for Donald Trump, but were so worried about these black folks taking to the streets and protesting that they then increased their turnout for him. And that's part of the reason why the Republicans did comparatively well in House elections, for instance. Pushing up the turnout ultimately may have, if not cancelled each other out, may have had a help for Joe Biden in the presidential, but a help for Republicans in the House. What do you think of that thesis?
Well, there's certainly a theory out there that especially Hispanic men did not all Hispanic men, but a number of Hispanic men did not respond well to the Black Lives Matter focus for whatever reason. They're quite socially conservative, all the rest of it. So the numbers, there was certainly something that drove a number of Hispanic men towards Trump in the last election. So maybe that is part of it.
So then, of course, we saw in January the unrest, the violence, the attempted insurgency, however you want to characterise it. This has also become one of those highly polarised issues as to, was this a reasonable protest at a perceived stolen election, or was this an attempt at overthrowing American democracy? There's still a lot of debate going on, literally, in the Senate this week, as to whether there will be an independent commission into the January 6th attacks.
Yeah, and the thing is, this is quite annoying because there's going to be an investigation. Yeah. There is going to be.
Congress is conducting its own investigation.
Yeah. It's just a question, is it going to be a bipartisan investigation or is it going to be a partisan investigation? And at the moment, Mitch McConnell has openly said to his people behind closed doors.
Openly behind closed doors.
Exactly, openly to them, that the quote was it would hurt the party's midterm election message.
Yeah.
They have asked for a bipartisan commission.
Yeah.
And so the actual fact, it would actually help Republicans. Might not help them in the midterms, but it would help them as far as the commission itself goes, because there's a deadline of 31st of December for the bipartisan commission. If they have a partisan commission, it'll go all the way to the election.
Right.
But they'll be able to condemn it as
So it's foolish
partisan.
to think that by not supporting an independent commission, that they can suddenly make the investigations that are ongoing look hyper-partisan, and that we're not going to be seeing in the attack ads next year up against pro-Trump House members, for instance, the fact that they voted against an independent investigation into this. So it's hard to see how the politics play well for Republicans, but it certainly says that they're not yet looking to distance themselves from Trump supporters, if not Trump himself.
Yeah, I think this is all about them trying to basically rubbish whatever investigation occurs. It's hyper-partisan and it's hackery and all that sort of. It's just a shame because it will stop us getting information.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Donald Trump this week giving more comments that have people, including a Newsmax interview, talking about running again in 2024. He's going to be resuming his rally schedule in June. He's going to be back on the stump. And it seems as though we're seeing the caveat he gave in his sources close to him, which are often him, or people named John Barron, that as long as his health's okay, he's going to run in 2024. Of course, the problem with that is, whenever he's talking about running, people that want to run in his image kind of have to sit in the bleachers for a while yet.
A lot of them have said, like Nikki Haley, for instance, have flat out said, I'm not going to run if Trump runs.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Look, it seems pretty clear that he's going to run if he can run.
Yeah.
But interestingly, his blog, from the desk of Donald Trump, has been doing terrible numbers. I don't have them in front of me, but Apparently, like really bad, real lack of interest in that blog, which is surprising because you think, well, people have been hanging on every word from him for the last 5 years.
Except that schlubs in the media, like me, keep going to the desk of Donald J. Trump, picking out the quotes and broadcasting them, so people don't have to go to the website, they just have to turn the TV set.
I think it's just you that's going to that blog at the moment. So you're keeping it alive.
All right, happy to help. Once again, we're out of time. We'll see you back here for another trip to Planet America at the same time next week.
And you're going to find longer interviews and much more on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube, where you'll also find the Pet Podcast in all the usual pod places.
Bye-bye.